the Administrative and Projects Committee meeting for the Contra Costa Transportation Authority to order and welcome everyone here. I'm going to ask that we take some things out of order this morning, if that's okay. Our vice chair has to leave around 9 o'clock, and so what I'd like to do is focus on the action items. So if there's, so perhaps we could start with.
Do public comment first.
That's right. Do you want to? Is there anyone who would like to make a public comment? Seeing none. Obviously, we'll take public comment on the items as we come up. So why don't we move on to item 14, which is the approval of a lump sum payment to CalPERS to pay off the authority's unfunded actuarial accrued liability and related budget actions. Mr. Carlson.
Okay. Good morning, APC Chair Tatson, members of the APC. My name is Randy Carlton. I'm the CFO for the authority. The item before you is requesting approval to make a $2.2 million lump sum payment to the California Public Employees Retirement System. We are a member agency, much like many of the commissioners are member agencies for the pension systems in their home jurisdictions. You know, we've seen unfunded pension liabilities as a matter of public policy evolving, right, over the recent years. We've seen PEPRA as new legislation taking effect throughout California. We've also seen the Government Accounting Standards Boards adopt a new pronouncement that calls for public agencies to now record their unfunded liability on their balance sheet. You know, before it was an off-the-balance sheet type of footnote description, but now it's going to show up in assets and liabilities just like, you know, any other debt. So, you know, the authority, like other agencies, we've been out there attending workshops and seminars learning more about GASB 68, about the changes, and Brian in particular attended a workshop, came back from that, and with a fresh look at reconsidering paying our unfunded liability. So some of the facts that we are taking into consideration here is that we owe $2.2 million of unfunded pension liability, and that's a matter of pay me now or pay me later. And we have cash assets to pay this debt, and I'll get into that more in a moment. The investments, whether the cash, whether it's invested here internally or invested with CalPERS is another factor. Currently, assets invested internally are earning about 0.5% to 0.75%. But while invested with CalPERS, they're going to earn the assumed rate of 7.5%. Now, there will be actual levels of return from year to year. In looking, you know, at this past year, it was 13.2%. Looking over the past 20 years, it was 7.6%. And looking at the past 30 years, it was 9.4%. There's also an immediate reduction to our payroll cost. We will be reducing our payroll pension cost by 5.5% effective July 1, the start of the next fiscal year. And, you know, one of my personal favorites as a CFO is it strengthens our balance sheet. It moves, you know, our assets, or it eliminates the need to record liability on our balance sheet, and that's a very positive factor as we talk about the financial strength of the authority, and particularly with the bond rating agencies. You know, this sounds like a good idea because it is a good idea. Public agencies have millions and millions of dollars of unfunded liability. Fortunately for the authority, we have the assets to make this type of decision, where in many public agencies they're making hard decisions to keep basic services going and just paying the minimum amount required for their pension systems. You know, going back to the funding source, I mentioned earlier, some of the things that we're thinking about is you know, the suitability of the type of money that we have to do this. This is one of those one-time money for one-time uses type of decisions. We're looking at the investment return, whether it makes more sense to get 0.5% or 7.5%. And after taking these factors into account, it's staff's recommendation that we use our Measure C cash reserve. We currently have a $6 million reserve. We are proposing that we would borrow $2.2 million from that reserve and pay it back over a few years as the fund balance on Measure C, which currently sits at about $35.7 million, earns interest, and we'll replenish that reserve over the next few years. Now, as noted in the staff report, when we talk about unfunded liability, this is a number that's reset every year as the actuary takes a look at actual rate of returns, takes a look at the actual results and the demographics in terms of how old people are living, the timing of our retirements, the age of our employees, and so they reset the numbers. And I'm just saying this because although if we do this and we will have a zero unfunded pension liability effective July 1, there may be a change in actuarial assumptions that would create a new unfunded liability, such as an example would be changes in the demographics, that people are living from 78 to 84. Well, if they make those type of actuarial assumptions, that's going to have the impact on the amount needed to fund our pension system and thereby creating an unfunded liability. So I'm just saying that just so that, in the future, if you don't come back to and say, Carlton, look, you told me, we paid this off and it's done. But in fact, there could be something that happens in the future that creates a new unfunded liability. Although there is that potential, I think if you were to ask me to look into the crystal ball, I think the opposite is more likely, where if we fully fund our pension system today, that we would be in a position where our pension position would be one of overfunded. I mentioned earlier that pension policies have evolved. Well, with one of the changes with PEPRA is that the unfunded or the surplus in a pension system can no longer be used for enhancements to pension plans. So, that was one of the things that was happening in the late 90s and the 2000s as pension systems were generating surpluses. Bargaining groups in particular were bargaining for additional pension benefits. Well, now PEPRA prevents that from being done, and PEPRA also prevents us from using that surplus to buy down our normal contribution rate. When we talk about our pension and what we pay on a payroll basis, there's two components. There's the normal pension rate, and then there's the unfunded rate. Our normal pension rate of 8% and an unfunded rate of, let's say, 7%. Well, the 7 is going to go away, but we'll always have the 8%. But the point I'm making is that if we have a surplus of funds in our pension system, we will not be able to buy down that 8%. However, if there is one of those circumstances, like I've mentioned, that we create a new unfunded liability, we can use that surplus to offset that. So one way to look at it, if there is a surplus, is that amount can be our rate stabilization funds, so that in any budgetary year we don't have to come back to you and ask for an adjustment in our pension rate because we have a surplus built in the pension system that we could use to offset that new unfunded liability. It really is a good position for a public agency to be in. Fortunately, we do have the assets to work with, and staff recommendation is that we bring this forward to the board for approval. I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I concur that it's a good idea and one that we should definitely consider. Are there other questions or comments? Commissioner Arnrich?
Randy, thanks. just before the meeting started, I want to go back. We can go to page 14.2 on the staff report, and it's under the pension fund status chart that you have there. So the market value of the assets, $7.5 million. Unfunded market value assets, or unfunded actuarial accrued liability is 2.2. So that's present day dollars. Present day dollar of the value of the assets is 7.5. So that's 30%. That's where I was mentioning the 30%. Just on face value numbers, that seems a really high percentage of that asset versus the unfunded liability. Am I misreading that in some way?
Well, I'm not quite sure I'm following.
Well, just to be clear, so market value of the assets, 7.553, 718. Unfunded liability we're talking about is a 2.180162.
Right.
That as a percentage of the market value of our assets is 30%.
At that point in time, yeah.
Right, that's right now.
Yeah.
So with the rates of returns that you were mentioning, how could it be that far off?
Well, we're not all retiring today. This takes into account that over the life of the agency, over the life of the employees, we are projecting that the total amount of benefits will be $12.2 million. Right. And how much in assets do we have now to offset that liability? We have $7.5 million.
So I guess the point, given how it is, this isn't something new. This couldn't have happened in 1 year. That's correct. And the fact is the rate of returns, the average rate of returns for CalPERS has been really good. I mean, there was dips, but actually the past few years have been extraordinary. It just seems off. Is this the first time, since I've been here since the 80s, is this the first time we've done this?
The first time of a payoff? Yes. Now, we brought, you may recall that in 2005, when CalPERS required all the smaller agencies to join a pool of, where there were 100 or fewer employees. Prior to that, we had our own pension carve out in the big system, but now we're part of all these other smaller public agencies. And at that time, CalPERS required those individual agencies to set aside the unfunded liability that they brought to the party at that point and start amortizing that. That has always been on the books since then. We've been paying that off over
How
15.
How much was that?
$550,000.
Okay.
Now,
so it's small.
the $2.2 million includes that number or the balance of it, and
it
includes the negative returns of the financial crisis that caused the balance of the unfunded liability.
Okay. All right. That's it. That I didn't understand. I agree with Dawn. Paying this, given our cost of money, if this is the best investment we can make, not paying it is a poor investment. Only because Caltrans essentially charges 7.5% a year compounded backwards for that liability. So is there how forward-thinking is this? I know you're saying, well, we don't know how long it'll carry us, but there hasn't been an adjustment in 10 years. Do we have some idea? Is this something based on if the assumptions are still true? Is this something we expect if we stay at 20 employees, same staff for a while? Do we expect to see another 10-year horizon for this?
We would expect it to be, if all the assumptions come true, then we would expect it to stay even at just paying the normal rate
through the life of the agency.
Without any new unfunded liability. That being said, the actuaries do recompute everything, every year,
right.
And they may, look at assumption changes that affect how much they're requiring people to pay into the pension system. So there's just no guarantees.
Yeah, but I think that's a good answer, though. I think the last thing it's worth underscoring is that we haven't changed our benefits. a lot of other agencies you said got really in financial trouble because they gave away a lot of benefits. They had no idea what they would cost. So I think this is the right recommendation at this time.
Commissioner Pierce?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I believe that the PERS actuarials are actually almost 2 years in arrears. Is that correct?
Yeah. The
And
numbers that are
so,
in the
so they
staff
aren't
report.
really current.
Right.
What we call current is actually 2 years old. And so there's always a lag time to catch up. So we're never really 100% caught up. But this would get us as close as PERS will allow us to get. Is that correct?
That's right. And the numbers in the staff report that we're just discussing are from June
Okay.
30, 2013.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely the way to go.
Is there any other comment?
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Taylor, second by Commissioner Pierce. Any further discussion? Any public comment? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Thank you. So let's move on to item 15, which is the discussion for remarketing our bonds.
Thank you. Again, this is an item brought from Finance. The item before you is requesting authorization to what we call remarket the 2012 B bonds that we issued in December of 2012. You may recall that we did two series of bonds at that point. We did a fixed, a conventional fixed rate transaction of 189 million, added some premium for a total of 225 million of construction proceeds. But we also issued $201 million of floating rate notes. The term on those notes was set for 3 years. We're now looking at that point in time when we need to reset that rate. And we're bringing this forward to you to seek your approval. All the documents have been prepared, reviewed by counsel. We're currently approaching the rating agencies where we expect to have our rating affirmed at a AA+. We're also preparing information for our investor presentations, our presentations that we'll be holding both locally and on the East Coast. And some of the background that I'd like to provide is that it may be counterintuitive to be suggesting that we do floating rate notes in such a low interest rate environment. This particular structure ties into our interest rate swap, which is also based on the short term of the market. So we really need to keep those two paired for as long as we have the swap in place. There are really only two moving pieces to the transaction. The interest rate, the spread. It's much like your adjustable rate mortgage where you have an index and you pay a spread on top of that index. That makes your total borrowing rate. Our total borrowing rate right now is about 3.75%. On that includes the elements of the swap that are built into that rate. And the index spread amount that we're paying right now is 37 basis points above a percentage of 30-day LIBOR. Some of our market indications now are that the spreads have widened. Interest rates on the short end in particular have come up a bit. But we will look at where the most cost-effective point is in the market for us at the time when we bring these forward. It could be for another 3-year term, it could be for another 4-year term, or it could be for a 4-year term, or it could be for a 5-year. The preference would be, to go 5-year if that's where the strongest investor interest happens to be, that results in the lowest cost of borrowing for the authority, and that's what we're seeking. The schedule, it calls for the bonds to be priced in early June. That is the earliest opportunity we can do this. The latest opportunity is December 15th. So there's a window of time there that, if we are accessing the market and it happens to be a terrible day in the market, some kind of international or economic news or some other triggering event that causes the market to move away from us in a significant fashion, we have the option to not issue the bonds on that day. As long as we execute the transaction by December 15th, we meet our mandatory tender date. That's what we have. That's what we'll need to do. The staff recommendation is to bring this before the board later this month to seek their approval, and with their approval, hopefully at that time we'll have the rating confirmation in hand that we could announce at that evening. We'll move forward with our investor presentations. We will meet with the investment banking team in New York. We'll offer these bonds for sale, and we'll do everything we can to negotiate the lowest cost of borrowing for the authority.
All right. Other questions or comments? Commissioner Taylor.
Yes. Bonds always fascinate me because it's a strange world. But how do you recoup? Like we paid $565,000. How do you recoup that expense when we refinance?
We really don't. It's a cost of doing the transaction.
Expensive as hell, right?
Yeah.
So do you save money in the long term to get some of that back, or is that just a flat commission house?
It's a cost.
It's a cost of
doing the transaction.
But there's got to be a way that it comes back to you, right?
I think maybe where you might be going is that, in comparing this type of bond transaction where it's remarketed every number of years, let's say 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, et cetera, versus the other type of bonds, the conventional fixed-rate bonds, where it's largely a one and done. Okay, we have the same type of cost of issuance, but on that fixed-rate deal, you pay it one time. Your bonds are out there for 20, 25 years, and nothing happens to them unless you choose to refinance them. This one has a higher cost to maintain because we are going back into the market every 3, 4, or 5 years. And as I mentioned earlier, this transaction is integrated with our swap. We really do need to have a variable rate type of debt so that it ties into the swap. And we can get into the discussion if you like. Essentially,
I'm swapped out.
Okay.
Been here long enough.
I'm happy to draw pictures and lines and straight lines and squiggly lines to
Well, let me ask a follow-on question.
Yeah.
So as you're marketing and you get ready to decide, do we want to go for a 3-year, 4 or 5 year bond? To what extent do you consider the remarketing costs as one of the factors in deciding how long to go for?
It's a cost-benefit analysis, absolutely. It can mean the difference between selecting 4 years or 5 years. Okay. If we're going to pay a little bit more for 5 years, but it's less than the cost of another transaction, then it makes sense to pay a little bit more in debt service.
And as I roughly understood this is the remarketing cost is what, about 25 basis points of the bond?
Well, let's go to that section in the staff report. There's various costs when we talk about the transaction. There's the underwriter itself, where 3% of the total cost. It's on page 15-4. Okay. The underwriter in particular, that is set by a negotiated fee. It's 1.5% for of the amount of bonds that are issued, and that pays for the sales commission of the dealer brokers that make the market for our bonds. It pays their expenses, and it's the cost that is incurred to bring these bonds to market. It's like the difference between a wholesale and a retail price.
And so the rate on our current bonds is what?
The bonds themselves?
Yes.
The bonds themselves will be
what's the current rate?
It's about 0.49% on the variable rate bonds themselves.
Today?
Yeah.
Okay. And so this adds on a 3-year, if we do this over 3 years, about another 9 basis points per year if you amortize it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Can I add something, Commissioner?
Yes.
So in a layperson's term, when I first got here, we went out to the market to sell and had a new money deal and then had to refinance this variable rate note. And we were concerned about the dialogue between whether or not we're going to keep the swap, so we kept the sales shorter in terms. And so Brian's gone, he went out to a class and came back, and you approved that item, and thank you for that, because it's going to save us some dollars the way he looks at it. So what he's trying to do as our finance manager, find ways of saving money. And so in answer to your question, Commissioner Taylor, the longer you go, the less times you have to go to market. And so what Randy's saying is he's going to do an analysis on what is the best package. Was it 5 years, and so we only have to do it 4 more times? Or is it 3, we have to do it 6 more, whatever the math works out to. And so he's looking at all those various options.
Okay. Commissioner Arner?
So we still have 19 years left on this?
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously it is a math exercise. When you see what the rate is, you can see what they offer and make it work out. Yeah, I'm swapped out too. It's a new term. You know what? We're kind of quietly dead on this issue because it's just part of what we have to do for one of our financing mechanisms, and it's a good time to be out in the marketplace. So its timing is good. Probably the sooner we do it, the better off we are. And let's get the math to work out, and hopefully we can set it as for 5 years. I'd go ahead and move the item.
Second.
All right, motion and a second. I'll just comment. I've got some minor comments on some of the documents, nothing significant. But I now know a whole lot about, for example, who provides water in the county because of LAFCO. That isn't quite correct in here. So the motion and a second. Any further discussion? Any public comment? I'd like our proposed underwriting team to stand up so we can recognize you.
You've got 2 financial advisors and an underwriter.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Great. Thank you. So I want to move on to the draft budget.
Yeah, one more finance item. APC Chair Tatson, and Brian will be bringing this forward. It is budget season. This is the first look at our budget for next fiscal year. This is the preliminary budget. We present this as an informational item to generate discussion, to hear your feedback. Then we come back in June, and we'll have a proposed budget at that time. We'll have a public hearing for the board. Brian has a few slides to go over that as a high-level overview of the budget. It's like to say that this is his 3rd budget. Time goes by fast, and appreciate all his dedication and effort to help us understand these numbers.
And before you start, I'd just like to say that I'm very appreciative of the efforts you put into item 14, which is going to save us some money on the pensions. We appreciate that. And helping with the bond sale. It would be nice if we can, I know we're really subject to what the market does, but if we could even just tie the last rate we got, that'd be good. And maybe do better. Anyway, please proceed.
And thank you. My goal is to make sure that as both Randys are sitting on the beach or golfing, that they don't go to the mailbox and go, "Where's my check? We should have paid it off." So good morning. I'm going to go through the preliminary budget. I'm going to do this quickly again as I understand someone needs to leave. As we get into the budget, I gave you guys just a snapshot of the PowerPoint presentation as well. In the following slides, I'm going to go through the details here. But just quickly, on the sales tax revenues, we're continuing to see some good growth. So for 2016, we're going to show about a 2.5% increase. And as we go to look at the federal, state, and local revenues, we see about a 19.5 million reduction. And one of the key points that we want to keep bringing forward is, no, we're not losing any funding. It's just the timing of the projects and different things. We're going to continue to seek as much outside funding as possible. And as we continue to AAA the projects, we're going to see more of that money coming into the authority. Investment returns, we're trying to ensure that those are increasing, and based off of some of the current market projections, we show an increase there. And then what I did on this slide new for this presentation is I segregated the bond proceeds and other sources. And I have other slides to go through how this all works out so that it makes sense for all of you. As we get to the projects department section, it shows a small increase there. The program section is mainly based off of sales tax revenue. And each of the programs get a certain percent. So as we earn more money, we pay out more to the individual programs. The planning section shows an increase of about $1 million. We have some outreach programs, and we also have some studies as well that are going to show the increase. Administrative section, we see a small increase based off of salaries, and also an increase as we bring in the document management system. We're going to need to have some outside staff to come in and help us implement it and get everything in there. Debt service, we talked about the remarketing, but there's also the plan to reissue about another $100 million in bonds later this year, which is going to require additional interest payment and principal payments as well. So that's would be the increases there. Sales tax revenues, we already covered that it's going to go up approximately about 2.5% based off of the State Board of Equalization. They show that there's probably going to be strong growth in California of about 5%. I went on the conservative side because I don't want people to think that they're going to get a lot more money through the programs and different things like that. So if you look back to 2011 as we were starting to recover, we're up about 27% since then, which is really good, and all of the other cities have probably seen that as well. The next slide is, you guys have also asked some key points of how much is retail of your total revenue for the authority. And if you look on this slide, the third item down in the far right-hand column, you can see that retail stores bring in about 20% of our revenue. New auto sales is about 12%. We have gas that continues to fluctuate. That was down. This is for the first 6 months of the fiscal year. The State Board of Equalization is about 3 months behind in getting us the information. So this is the raw data that we have there. We can show overall for the first 6 months, we're up about 4.28%. And that includes the holiday season. And as we talked about the federal money or the grants that we're getting and the outside sources, you can see that that's slightly decreased. I'll get into another slide later that gets into the details of which projects have completed. The Caldecott and some of the Highway 4 is a big component of the reduction from 63 to 43. And then here we go. Here's the breakdown of how we've gone down about $19.3 million. RM2 money is down about $6.8 million. That is in regards to the Caldecott and SR4 phases are being completed. We also had an increase in there where I-80 and I-680 carpool lanes are getting RM2 funding in there as well. The BATA funds decreased about $5.3 million. That's mostly due to SR4 160. One of the things the authority does is we try and use all our outside revenue sources before we use the Measure J money to help our interest earnings. One of the other big components in there is other funding, shows down about $6.7 million. The component in there is we collect a lot of money from cities and contributions from Antioch. We got a great contribution from the town of Danville. $600,000 of that was for the sound wall, and then also we had a $5.9 million payment for the TDV funds, which is to help for the construction on 680. And then as one of the other funding sources for the program, when we want to look at, this is just the Measure J projects. This lists out the proposed budget for all of the Measure J projects there. And we just discussed the $37.5 million of funding. So as we go through each individual project, you'll see the individual funding source and how it applies to each one of the projects. So we have 141 million. We have the 37 million in the column spread out to the right, and then you have the far right-hand column which shows bond proceeds. So whatever's not funded by outside sources needs to be funded by Measure J. One of the funding sources we use is the bond proceeds to build the projects now and pay for them in the future when our projects are complete. So that's about 104.1 million. And then we have the other sources, which is the sticky point, is how do you use or the definition of we're using reserve funds. And cities don't like to dip in the reserve because it means that you're spending more than you have. Here at the authority, in the first column there, we list out every single percent of all the programs. Where does all the money go? Capital projects gets about 42.5%. Return to source for local streets is 20%. So as we go through all that money and we have the $82.4 million, you can see where all the money goes and it builds up. And one of the three of the items I'm going to talk about here is the TLC, the Transportation for Livable Community projects. So we continue to add money to that checkbook for those programs. And through the strategic plan, everything is designated to be paid out of each one of these little checkbooks. So if it takes the local cities to many years to get through the environmental, the studies, and the construction phases, it takes, we're building up that money in years before. So you can see that there's about a reduction of about $7.6 million for the TLC. You can see sub-regional needs is about $2.8 million, and some of the other ones, they dip into prior year funds that are earmarked there. Quickly, I'll go through some of the projects. For TLC, one of the big projects is the Richmond Transit Village, BART to 19th Street. That's about $2.4 million. Then we have Central Concord pedestrian improvements and streetscape. That's about $2.2 million. We have San Pablo Dam Road pedestrian improvements, about $1.2 million. And then under pedestrian, bicycle, and trail facilities, we have the East Bay Regional Park District projects for West and Southwest County at about $400,000. Richmond Transit Village East Side improvements is about another $350,000. And then under the sub-regional transportation needs, we got about $650,000 there. And then here is another comparison of the projects and the different phases. The proposed expenditures for the entire authority is about $253.9 million. Project expenditures, that includes Measure C and Measure J, increased about $3.7 million to $153.1 million. And as you see on there, the Caldecott Tunnel is winding down for $11.5 million. The BART, the rail extension, is supposed to be making a lot of payments this year, so you can see that that went up about $30 million. And then the SR4 bypass elements, as some of these projects are starting to come to completion, we're paying less. So the capital projects are always up and down depending on the different phases. As we get into the individual departments, administrative costs are $2.3 million, and I had mentioned earlier that it's going to go up about $100,000, which is salaries, and it includes the additional temporary staff member to come in and help us with the document management system. These figures here and throughout the document don't include any of the reductions from the payoff of the CalPERS. That's estimated anywhere between $150,000 to $170,000 based off of what our salaries are for next year. We still, in administration, we have the 1% cap. That's about 88%. If we take into consideration the reductions, that's going to bring us down to about 84, 85%. The programs, as we discussed, is all based off of return to source outlined throughout the strategic plan. Planning is increasing only because of the outreach for the 2014 transportation plan. And then we have about $2.2 million in studies for I-680 and the high capacity in West Contra Costa. Debt service is increasing $4.5 million due to the estimated interest payment in March of $4.5 million, depending on when we go to market on that. So that's our budget. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very concise report, and I appreciate that. A question on return to source funds. I'm looking at page 1622 of the report, and that's Exhibit 4, which shows sort of 18% return to source. The second line there that shows last year 1.68 and this year 1.722, is that the true-up fund line item? Is that
I must
true?
have missed what page.
1622, Exhibit 4. What I'm after, I'm trying to find is because we were just doing our budget in Danville. I can see our payments from Measure C, which were ironically flat for 2 years, but in fact our projections versus. So is this second line item there, is that the true up?
Basically, what happens for the town of Danville, we pay you out based on you're talking your return to source for the street maintenance, correct?
Well, for the 18% return to source.
Okay, you get the 18%, and then you get a 2.09% as well. And on that, it's all based off of what our sales tax actual revenues are. So once we finish the year, in 15 over 14, we only went up 1.5%. So that's how you can see your money's being flat. So as we're earning more money, there's more money that gets returned to source. But also part of that, in the details and the weeds, is how many miles of streets you have. How much was your population? So when Brentwood adds more streets, they get a bigger share of the pie. And as their population increases, they're starting to get more because they have higher demands. So as all the other cities do that as well.
So the more Bob grows, the more we go down.
Actually,
And you know what? He's getting too big to sit next to me, so I'll tell you. But here's the question. The question that I was really after, and I appreciate that explanation, is what I was looking after. We do an estimate, and that's what we pay out. So how do we do the true-up, and how do we account for that? Because it's just an estimate. At the end of the year, we estimate a budget, and on sales tax revenue, it's a guess, and it comes above or below that, and then we get an actual number. Don't we go back and true up the distribution then?
Well, I think Ross has an answer.
I don't have an answer to that question, Commissioner Arner.
But that's the only answer I want.
This line that you're pointing at, the base is 18% across the county, and certain jurisdictions or certain regions had an extra.
Yeah, I'm not
amount.
concerned about that. I was
Okay.
looking up for the true-up line, and I was trying to ask, and you explained what that 2% was, and I'd forgotten. But where do we true up?
There is no true up on the return to source. There's paste. So when you get your calendar years approved by the Planning Commission and Martin approves it, you get paid the actual.
So if
So
the
you're
revenues
usually a
were-
year behind on all of our payments to you guys because we're waiting for the actual.
So we're paying actual, but we don't true them up because we delay it a year.
Yes, because we need to collect. It's not a delay. So if you have everything through the Planning Commission, everything's been approved, and you guys are on schedule and staying ahead of the curve, we could pay you in November for what we receive in August and September when we know what our actuals are. So it's the timing of when you get everything approved in planning. That becomes, I'm not an exact, I don't know the exact answer, but once you get the calendar year approved, there's a timing gap of when you get paid.
Right, and there should be, but there's also a bigger timing gap than August to November when the county trues up or franchise tax. So I'm just asking. I've never seen the true-up account, but it just seems to be that we have a slight time lag, and are we just saying, well, that's what we approved, we'll move on?
So maybe I can answer your question. And I, in my experience here in 5 years, the city of Clayton wanted their return to source dollars early. They accepted $270,000, and then when it trued up, the revenue had dipped, and so the makeup was in the second year, a reduction in the estimated check. So you can either accept it when the thing's finalized, or you can accept it early, and then if there's a true up, it happens the next year. But I'll double check that because that's how I got an earful from.
Yeah, I just expect. So knowing all that, and maybe I'm making this complicated, there should be a line item there which shows what our true-up is, positive or negative from year to year, because that was carried over. So in the ledger someplace it shows they owed X amount of dollars. Just on our budget, I don't see it.
Yeah, we'll double check on that.
Yeah, so that's what I'm asking is where does that show up? And maybe it needs to be a little deeper. Maybe it's hidden inside it. That was it.
Okay. Are there other comments or questions? Is there any public comment? So I think the recommendation is for us to, you're going to bring back a revised version in the next month, and then that's the one we'll forward to the board.
That's right. This is an informational item
Okay.
only. If there are any comments from the APC, we would gladly take those into consideration. If there's any analysis needed, we would bring that back to you in June.
So I haven't heard any request other than the one that Commissioner Arnridge made, just to explain the reconciliation process. Okay, so since the rest of us are staying, maybe we could go back to the legislation item. No,
Get the minutes.
Sure.
That's an action.
Okay.
I would move approval of minutes.
Okay, there's a request that on the one set of minutes that we change the special meeting, that we change the time at which we ended the meeting, because it suggested that we started the meeting at noon and we ended at 10 a.m.
Oh.
So, so,
Past that.
so I assume your motion is subject to that modification. All right. Any other comment? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Move the consent calendar.
All right. Is there anyone who wish to remove any item from the consent calendar? Okay, seeing none, is there a second? Okay. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Now legislation.
Thank you. Good morning, Commissioners. I will give you a brief update on the federal side before I let our state advocate, Mark Watts, get into the details of what's happening. My report hasn't seemed to change very much in the last few months. We're still hearing a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. about how to fund a reauthorization of MAP 21 and fund the Highway Trust Bill, but it remains a lot of talk and very little action. At this point, MAP 21 is set to expire May 31st, and Congress is scheduled to begin their Memorial Day recess on May 22nd. So the odds of them putting a funding package together and getting it passed before that time are very, very slim. So I think we're potentially looking at another extension of MAP 21, and the talk has now shifted to how long that extension should be in order for them to negotiate a longer package. I know that the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Boxer and Senator Imhoff are really thank you, are really trying to push for a long-term bill up to 6 years. But whether they have the support to hold the rest of Congress's feet to the fire to pass something is yet to be seen. So I will keep you posted on how things transpire, but I don't think there's any very positive news happening out of Congress at the moment related to transportation funding. And there's a brief report in your packet, so I won't elaborate further unless you have any questions. And I know there's quite a bit of action happening at the state level, so I'm going to turn it over to Mark to give you a brief update on that.
Are there questions regarding the federal situation? All right, so let's then turn, Mark, tell us what's going on in Sacramento.
Thank you very much. I thought I'd just give you a quick overview of a couple things that are coming our way in Sacramento, and then touch on several of the bills that we've talked about recently and give you an update on those, and maybe delve a little bit into some of the issues that are emerging surrounding the transportation finance bill. So in the coming week, we expect the May revise to come out end of next week, and that's going to be the starting bell for discussions around cap and trade and possibly expanding some of the programs or including more money in some of the categoricals. So we expect to see that to become very intense. In addition, on May 14th, the two select committees, one from each house on passenger rail, are conducting a joint meeting to kind of bring the members up to speed on what kind of rail issues are out there, what's confronting the rail community, and then go into some of the more innovative issues like the PTC and crash avoidance technology for the benefit of the members of those committees. So I'll be reporting back on how that went forward. In terms of legislation, the last time I think I spoke about AB 1098, and that was the measure that was seeking to replace the CMP process, or the metrics within the CMP process, eliminating level of service and replacing with VMT and other like metrics. That measure did not get taken up and has been made into a 2-year bill. Another measure that's in the same space, AB 779, actually intends to delay the OPR onset of guidelines from 2016 to 2017. It's being sponsored by infill developers and others who want these new metrics, but they want them done in a way that they would be able to work with communities throughout the state to on the modeling aspect. They're concerned that the modeling may be too technically challenging to have as soon as 2016. So that measure seems to be the one that probably emerges, and I think Mr. Bloom and his bill will follow along next year with his effort to make more statewide on the metrics. So that's that update. It is exciting up there. SB 16, which I briefly described, which is Senator Bell's effort to bring $3.5+ billion a year for 5 years to transportation for roadway preservation and maintenance and safety projects, passed through the Senate Transportation Committee last week, and yesterday passed through Senate Governance and Finance, which is really the tax committee. It's notable that in both cases it was a bare majority for passage was achieved, and it was not bipartisan. So you can see how things are starting to line up in Sacramento. What I wanted to do for you, rather than go through the details of the bill, which I've discussed previously, if you would like me to, I can revisit them briefly for you. But I thought I'd give you a flavor of some of the emerging issues, not stumbling blocks, but issues that need to be considered by Senator Bell. On the one hand, ironically, we have Senator Cannella from Central Valley, Republican, who is very engaged in this process, but thinks that the amount of revenues being generated is insufficient to meet what he sees as the challenges. So he continues to collaborate with Senator Bell in trying to move the dial up a bit in terms of the revenues. Of course, that's a challenge because the mix of revenues that's available in Senator Bell's bill, each are balanced, and if you start to increase one, you run into challenges with the other ones. So we'll see. Interestingly, he is also pushing for things that are not within the framework of the bill. For example, the framework is around state shop and maintenance, and at the local level, maintenance, preservation, and safety projects. He's looking at how do I get more money for transit, more importantly for rail, and more specifically for ACE. And he's also looking at how can we get more money in for capacity projects such as the typical STIP projects. So those are some of the issues that are starting to emerge. One that needs some more focus on, and it may actually starting to be settled down a bit, and that's the issue that relates to the distribution of the funds. So the theory of the bill was half the money to the state, half the money to locals, but there's a 5% takeoff off the top that's dedicated to new sort of a self-help program for new aspiring counties who have never enacted a sales tax. And the idea is to hold that out there as a plum in putting together their expenditure plans. The funds would be available each year, and if there was no successful sales tax that qualified, then the money would go back into the pot and be distributed. So it's more of a one annualized incentive program to put out there. Some of the discussion centers around, is it fair to look at the 38 counties as the only eligible participants, the ones that don't have sales taxes, when you've got other counties that are trying to do renewals or extensions of the current ones, and that kind of financial incentive from the state could be viewed from a purely political campaign perspective as beneficial. So that discussion is going on. I will not project where I think that's going to end, but right now the author's standing with the bill as is. One interesting note that I think I did not mention when I presented previously here was the gas tax increase proposed by Senator Bell is 10 cents per gallon. The The diesel tax increase is 12 cents per gallon. That differential increase, that 2-cent difference, is actually being dedicated to truck or freight corridor projects. But to put it in perspective, the diesel rate of sales in the state is a lot less than gas. So 2 cents per gallon diesel that's being dedicated generates about $50 million annually. So it's probably a good start, but probably if you're going to go down that path, probably need to think of other ways to flesh that out more. And interestingly, legislation passed last year continued the Trade Corridor Investment Fund that was initially in Prop 1B, which funded nearly $2.5 billion worth of trade corridor improvements. That program was continued in law subject to being funded. So the mechanics are very simple. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. You've got the regional collaboratives that were pretty successful in making sure that program worked well. That same structure would be in place to accept these new revenues. So those are some of the highlights of issues I wanted to bring to your attention. And there's two last measures I want to discuss briefly. One is SCA 7 by Senator Huff. This is connected to SB 16 in that it would seek to protect any new transportation tax revenues generated by the legislature in the current year. It did not receive a warm welcome. It's an interesting idea. I think a lot of folks think it makes sense. But if you're looking at a 5-year time horizon on this bill and what the speaker is speaking about in terms of her framework, protecting funds, you wouldn't be able to get to the ballot to 2016. So the effect of protection is pretty limited. But there are discussions going on now between the Senate Republican leader, Senator Huff, and Senator Bell about how they may join forces, and we may see SCA 7 get propelled forward a bit. And finally, I would just comment there's a very interesting dialogue and legislative program underway to extend the current P3 law. The legislation is sponsored by Henry Perea from the Fresno area is AB 1265. It passed transportation with a great deal of cheerleading by the transportation chair. It is in Appropriations Committee and was sent to the suspense file because it has some minor costs associated with it. The issue there, of course, is the Caltrans engineers want to carve out more specific work duties for themselves in the P3 world, and that is a battle that's going to be difficult to overcome. But hope remains, and we'll see how that measure moves forward. So that would conclude my comments for today.
Are there questions or comments? I did just, you had mentioned the passenger rail, the 3 Capital Corridor, Los Angeles, San Diego, or San Luis Obispo, San Diego, and the San Joaquin. We all had a legislative day last week in Sacramento, and collectively we probably met with about 15 legislators. So I got to meet with a bunch of legislators from the Central Valley, including, for example, Assemblymember Perea, who is the son of one of our members who is a former state senator, Henry Perea. So it was the support for passenger rail is very good. I think one of the situations we face is that historically, passenger rail in the state has had sort of a guaranteed funding off, some of the some of the bonds, things like that. And right now we're getting funding from cap and trade, but it's competitive. And so we're pretty much assured, based on these meetings, of the $25 million we collectively need next year. But one of the nice things we did, and I'll bring it to the authority meeting, is that the staff of the 3 agencies put together a joint brochure to talk about passenger rail in the state. And when we talked to each member of the Assembly or Senate, we talked about what all of us wanted, not just what one of us wanted. And so that's good. The challenging news is that collectively we think we need about $6.5 billion over the next 10 years for the kind of expansions that we think are warranted. $4.5 billion of that for the San Luis Obispo San Diego corridor, but $1.5 billion for San Joaquin. So that'll be much more of a challenge, along with trying to find some secure funding. But I also will be going to the meeting that Mark referenced on May 14th. So, all right. Commissioner Arnold?
Mark, thanks for your report and kind of the overview. Just on a specific local bill on Mark Levine's bill for the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. You know, I guess I remember when I used to drive across that in 74, 75, Marin County was short in water. They closed one of the lanes, put a pipe across there, then they left it there for 15 years. And then they decided the bridge was falling down, so Caltrans closed the other lane on the decks because they needed a lot of access. And then they took the pipe off and kept the lanes closed. And is there really logic? I mean, that bridge is bumper to bumper both directions during rush hour. I mean, they're really considering going back to, it was 3 lanes in each direction, go 3 lanes eastbound, which I guess means going south, and putting a bicycle lane going north? Is that still where they're at with that? I mean, that just seems, from my seat, a little insane.
I can affirm the facts that, yes, that is the plan. MTC is, I think there's a lot of support to restore the 3 lanes. They're trying to figure out how would you put a bike lane in there as well, but the real challenge isn't the lanes on the bridge. It's how do you get the bikes down off the bridge in a safe manner that's cost effective.
But it still means not going back to the capacity we used to have and giving that lane up, the empty lane now.
I think the intent is to provide 3 lanes for motorized and figure out how to add a bike lane to the facility, and then how do you connect the...
So it'd be 3 lanes on each deck?
Commissioner, let me, you want me to help you out?
Please.
So we're heavily involved in this issue. So what prompted this was in the evening commute heading back into Contra Costa, you can't get out of San Rafael, and so they're looking at trying to add that 3rd lane on the bottom deck for vehicles to help flush that queue out, because they've got so many accesses to 580 to access the bridge. So they got that kind of a loop system there. So the idea was to open up that bridge. Now we said if you're going to open up the lower deck for cars, you're going to have to move those bicycles to the other side, and you're going to have to lay back. There's this retaining wall that causes a sight distance problem. And so if you add more, right now the constriction is in San Rafael, so it's pretty much okay coming across the bridge, and it's orderly flow around that curve. It has short sight distance, and when you go there, you'll see this retaining wall. And so if you're going to add more traffic and the speed's going to go up, then you're going to have to deal with that sight distance issue right there. And so the plan, and you really don't need legislation to do what they want to do. You need the dollars, because I think the political will is there. And our concern is twofold. One, get the bikes, or actually 3, get the bikes from the south side to the north side, lay back that retaining wall so that you can have better sight distance. And then number 3 is make sure that the choke point isn't moved from the Marin side all the way to where they want to exit, drop the one extension of the auxiliary lane at the, what is that called? Richmond Parkway?
The approaches to Richmond Parkway and the transition to Richmond Parkway.
In return, they're looking at trying to get bikes to go over the structure on the top deck, because that's not the problem.
But that would take a lane out. It
Well,
would take
they're
the
not-
lane that's
They would
out.
take the shoulder, and so they're trying to figure out how do you do a sliding barrier? What do you do?
So just to be clear, would it be 3 lanes in each direction?
No.
No, 3 lanes in the
3 lanes
What direction
southbound?
It'd be
2
3
lanes
lanes.
northbound.
southbound.
Yeah, I guess it's southbound, and the problem is it's really what Randy's describing is concentrated within a few hours in the afternoon. In the morning, traffic spread out more. Plus, it's metered by the toll gates. So
Weekend traffic, though, it's the opposite.
the weekend
Northbound
traffic is a problem.
So you don't need an EIR to reopen the lanes. They need an EIR to put bikes in that. Wow. So are we weighing in this as an agency? So we've weighed in to support that?
The legislation or the concept?
Both.
We haven't weighed in on the legislation, but we have made sure that first of all, they got to study to make sure they understand, is the queue moving into Contra Costa and what's the magnitude? Because right now, the queue, the choke point is on the Marin side, and they can't get out of San Rafael. And those people that can't get out at night are Contra Costa residents. So our concerns are
I support
twofold.
that.
One is you got to fix that sight distance problem, because you can't create an accident problem. And as speed rises there, your bicycles have a very small space in which they're trying to get through that, what do you call it, the narrows, I guess? The narrow area?
Over on Marin?
On our side. What would you call it? Right there where, I mean, it's like a 4-foot shoulder, and somebody got hit the other day and killed. And so they were trying to build a bridge on top of that rock outcropping. And what was the estimate for that?
Well, there's contaminated soils because it's right there by Chevron,
expensive.
so it's very expensive. But in terms of some of the things we're doing, so the project team's meeting with the City of Richmond within the next couple of weeks just to go through some of the preliminary traffic analysis. They don't have the final forecasts. And then relative to the afternoon in the direction heading to Marin, by switching the bikes from the south side to the north side, there will be some bridge widening through there and some restriping. So we're looking at what we can do for that queue that it sometimes goes back over half a mile, primarily only in the weekends or if there's an incident. But the bridge itself doesn't have a capacity issue in the direction towards Marin.
I'm from regional, from Contra Costa's perspective. I think we ought to be supporting doing 3 lanes, both directions. Support the idea of getting across all our bridges bicycles, but it needs to have its funding source and it needs to figure out where to put it. Putting it on the bridge is just dangerous unless you're going to add it on the outside, redesign that structure, and go all the way across.
They'll have a temporary, or not a temporary, a movable barrier to separate the cars from the vehicles.
And we're still taking a lane up that we used to have.
Yeah, and I think maybe Chair Pierce has some insight on this too. My belief is if we're not putting bikes up there, the funding goes away for any potential
we don't
for
have enough
3
money
lanes.
to do the bikes, but the funding goes away. So if you don't do bikes, we're not going to do a project anyway. That's a lot of money to do that. I'm just saying we ought to be focusing, our agency ought to be focusing on getting a capacity that we used to have. And the extortion of money to get something, I'm sorry, I don't buy into that. And that's what it is. It's extorting transportation dollars to get bicycles, which is purely recreational. I ride, but that's a luxury. That's not a necessity for moving goods and services and people to their jobs.
Our original goal when we got involved was twofold. One, if you're going to allow the 3rd lane on the bottom deck to be cars, move the bike path on the other side because our citizens are getting killed. And then if you're going to do that, measure where the choke point is so we can understand if we're going to create the same problem that you have in Marin, now it's in Contra Costa. We don't like that idea. So we want to measure the magnitude. And then the dialogue started about, well, extend that bike path over the bridge. Now that's, as Ross says, it's metered now. I mean, you have the toll plazas. You can crank down the meters and take the money slower or whatever and control that queue going over that. So, I mean, that's the piece that I'm not sure how to explain it, but that was the added later is they're talking about putting bikes. They've been trying to put bikes on that bridge since I worked in District 4 and before I worked in District 4.
And it is part of the designated Bay Trail, so there is some amount of support for that project.
No, I was just going to say, that has nothing to do with Sacramento. Am I correct?
What's the bill?
The bill was born out of frustration by
Right. So I'm trying to get your response of.
I didn't quite hear the exact question. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just making sure you were interested in what we're discussing here.
I am.
Oh, okay.
No, I've been tracking it.
Oh, okay. That's good. Because we seem to be getting in pretty depth of it on our side. So we want to make sure the info here is going to you so you can take it to there.
I will.
Oh.
We have one action item left, item 17, the approval of key policy issues for development of the 2015 update to the Measure J strategic plan.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and board members. I'll handle this item. We update the Measure J strategic plan every 2 years to reassess our revenue projections, cash flow needs, and debt service cost assumptions. This update will be the 5th since we did the first one in 2007. It will focus on the period between fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 21.
We are seeking your approval today to kick off the process for the update and get your input on 3 key policy issues that will guide the development of the plan. The 3 policy issues are related to our revenue projections, using our debt capacity to accelerate projects, and programming the additional capacity in the plan. In regard to the first one, the revenue projections, the revenue scenario that you adopt basically will drive how much debt we can issue and how much additional programming capacity we will have in this plan. In the last strategic plan, we hired EPS to do the revenue projections for us, and we ended up using their baseline scenario. Back in February, we hired them again to update their projections, and their updated forecast is shown on page 17.3 in your packet. The new forecast shows a modest increase in our revenues over the life of the measures, about $10 million in year of expenditure dollars, or less than 0.5% more than the last one. We do recommend using their updated baseline revenue forecast for the strategic plan. The second issue relates to whether the authority wants to continue to accelerate the delivery of projects by issuing bonds versus pay-as-you-go strategy. As you know, we expect to issue a $100 million bond in the next few months, and based on the last strategic plan, we are expecting to issue another bond in the 2017-2018 timeframe. We do recommend that we continue with our current strategy by utilizing our debt capacity to accelerate projects, with understanding that we can always revisit the timing and the size of the last bond in the next update in the strategic plan, the 2017 strategic plan. And finally, the last issue relates to the programming of the modest additional capacity that we have due to the revenue increase. When you take out the 60% for programs, we're only talking about $4 million available to projects. Rather than programming this money to specific projects, we recommend that you hold it in a construction reserve. Given the size of our construction program at this time, we may need to tap into it, and we established this reserve in the last strategic plan. We put $5.7 million in the reserve. We ended up using $2.3 million through a strategic plan amendment for the EBART project. So with that, we do plan to finish this by the December 2015 timeframe, and the reason for the timing is we want to get input on the 2016 step so we can coordinate the both fund sources.
All right, so there are 3 recommendations. Are there comments?
I agree with all 3. I think this is, we've been well served by the estimates. The baseline is perfect. Yes, on the reserve, we know we're more in construction. We need that money set aside. I'd move the item.
Second.
Motion and a second. Thank you for bringing it to us. I concur. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Great. So are there any commissioner comments? Chair, executive staff comments? Seeing none, then we will adjourn in memory of Will Barnes and extend our condolences to the Pierce family. Thank you. That's right. Yeah.